And here we are. Welcome, everyone. This is our third session of the discussion of my book on reading assessment, linking language literacy and cognition. And today we are going to spend a little time on intelligence. And we may also talk about oral language assessment and underlying processes. And by underlying processes, I mean phonological awareness and rapid naming. So, but before I sort of dive in, I just want to know, is there anything in particular that anyone has a burning desire to hear about today? Sandy's shaking your head. Everyone's kind of shaking their head. If you come up with things, don't be afraid to stop me. So this is just sort of my plan for the day. So anyway,
I'm glad we'll be talking about the Matthew effect. That was one particular thing I put an exclamation by in the book, especially about, if you're reading, you're getting so much more vocabulary.
I found that I spent a little time studying Matthew effects because they're actually much more broad-reaching than we think about. So Tara, you talk about vocabulary, which is like hugely important, but we're going to kind of make that picture a little bit bigger. Sort of, we'll try to spend some time on the end to talk about it. It really is just very interesting, and it makes me think about the statistics we have on how the National Assessment of Educational Progress statistics on how it is our students are doing as readers. Because if you're not in a position to be able to learn from reading, then you are really not developing your thinking skills in many different ways. And I find that a little bit scary, but we'll come back to that, and I'll talk to you why I think it's scary. So anyway, let me kind of let me kind of dive in. So I'm calling it a grossly incomplete review of intellectual assessment, right? I'm just picking out some highlights to kind of give you some folks some ideas. And let me just say, I don't think we do right by educators in terms of intellectual assessment. That, if you're a school psychologist, then you get trained in what intelligence is and how it is to assess it. But if you are a classroom educator, or you're an SLP, or you're a reading specialist, oftentimes you are not trained in that area. So I think it makes it harder for everyone to participate in our team meetings and to have and to really have discussions about our students' profiles and what their strengths are and what their weaknesses is. So I started several years ago, doing my best to train anyone who crosses my path in the area of intellectual assessment, because I just think that we all benefit and our students benefit. So we will talk about domains of intelligence. You'll find that I talk a lot about the Wechsler intelligence scales, which is, let me just say, is my preferred way of measuring intelligence. And I'll talk a little bit about why, because there's lots of different ways to measure it. You're going to see there's lots of different ways to conceptualize intelligence and to look at our students' profiles. And then we are going to try to end with a little bit on Matthew effects. So that is the plan. So let me just say, this idea, what constitutes intelligence, has been debated for like many, many, many years. And here you have Spearman, who might be regarded as one of the saints of the field of intelligence. He did a lot of work in statistics and also what it is that made people smart. And he has this really fascinating quote, which he says that intelligence at this point, this was in the 1920s, is a word with so many different meanings that finally it has none. So it was in the 1920s we were having sort of roiling, I think that's the word I wrote, rolling debates, right, about what it is that constitutes intelligence. And this came from a need to understand our student population better, but also understand individuals who are entering the military. So what it is that Spearman had to say, and what is it that we think about intelligence. So we know it has something to do with smart, right? We know, we all have this idea that intelligence has something to do with being good at things. And there are two sort of main views of intelligence. And you can think of one as, I'm going to call them the lumpers and the splitters. So the traditional view, these are the lumpers, is that intelligence is this singular thing. And we often represent it with the lowercase g. So if you can see that in my image here, so that intelligence was a singular entity that allows us to do a lot of different things. Spearman, back in 1904, came up with what has been referred to as a two-factor theory. And what he said was that intelligence consisted of this general ability, this thing called G, and also more specific abilities that were more specialized. And he kind of saw four domains. He saw spatial intelligence, he saw mechanical intelligence, and then he also saw something, I have them in uppercase letters here, logical intelligence and mathematical intelligence. And he saw these two areas as being the most important. And logical in his mind was like, you can substitute verbal intelligence for that. Okay. He also did some other things which turned out to be really useful in the field of intelligence. He gave us ways of looking at specific abilities under that G umbrella and how they related to each other so that we could grasp ultimately what it is they have in common. And this thing is called factor analysis. And when you sit in on team meetings, you'll often hear that your evaluator is talking about different groupings of skills, right, that together comprise a composite or an index. Like, can you just nod? You've all participated in team meetings and you've heard, like, right? Sometimes we think in terms of like that full scale IQ. So that full scale IQ would be our numeric way of representing G. But we think about that full scale IQ as consisting of skills in different domains. Those would be with that letter S. We all together, we're good? Really, we're a small group, don't be afraid to stop me. So I'm just going to stop here for a second and say that how it is that you and I perceive intelligence and what we think of intelligence plays a big role in the ways that we view the various reports that we get on our students. And that these different ways of viewing intelligence really play sort of a big role in the kinds of tests that evaluators opt to work with. So you would think that if you had 4 different ways of measuring IQ, that you would end up with the same representation of G. You would think that, like, no matter how you measure IQ, you would get the same result, because in theory, right, all these tests are measuring the same thing. But it turns out that there are lots of different views of what comprise intelligence. And because of that, there are lots of different ways of measuring intelligence. So test A may not give you the same quote unquote IQ as test B. And I just want you to think about what the implications are of that situation for a minute, because it means that the evaluator has this huge responsibility to understand these different ways of viewing intelligence and to select tests that will appropriately show our students' abilities. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more kind of as we go through, because this is that thing that I refer to as test roulette. You pick your test and you live with the result, right? And the test that I pick hopefully is going to show my child in all their glory and all the wonderful things that they can do in the different ways that they can problem solve, because that measurement, that view of that particular child is going to be, what's the word I want? That as educators, we are going to look at those numbers and look at that view, and we are going to fashion our understanding of this child and his or her abilities. So if we choose a test that really doesn't permit a child to strut their stuff and show us their problem-solving skills, then all of the educators who come to our meeting may look at that child as an individual with less ability than he or she really has. And we know that's a very, very, very real thing. And I don't know how many years ago it was, 40 or 50 years ago, there was a study done in New York City. And what they did is they took two groups of students. They had a group of students who were gifted, and they had a group of students who were lower functioning, right? And they gave them to classroom teachers, only they switched their identities so that the classroom teacher thought she was getting a gifted group when she was really getting a lower functioning group. And the other teacher thought she was getting a lower functioning group when she was really getting the gifted group. And what they found was that the students performed according to the teacher's expectations. So how we measure like IQ has really important implications for children's futures and the services that we get, because we kind of know that it's easier to get services for brighter children than it is for children on the lower half of that bell curve, right? And we've all seen that at team meetings, you know, in particular, like there's an expression in the assessment world that when we have children who get IQ scores in the 80s, so an 85th percent, a standard score of 85 would be like a 16th percentile rank when we get children kind of in that range. And individuals have a tendency, professionals have a tendency to kind of go, well, what is it you expect, right? There's not a lot of ability here. So anyway, intelligence thing is really, really important. It has been a topic of fierce debate for a long time, and I just wanted to kind of take you through some of the highlights of the critical views of intelligence. Remember Howard Gardner? Remember when he came up with this idea of multiple intelligences, right? So he was not a lumper, he was a splitter, right? Because he believed that we demonstrated skills in specific domains, and that this emphasis on logical thinking and mathematical intelligence was like way overrated. So I don't know if you remember, do you remember any of the intelligences that he came up with? Do you remember? I remember that very clearly. It was like
Kinesthetic, I remember.
Emotional.
Emotion, yes, he added emotional, he added kinesthetic. I mean, he had kinesthetic, he had sort of movement, he had certainly
Was
had
there musical?
there was a musical intelligence. And
Yeah.
and the crazy thing is like the more as time went on, he kept adding intelligences. So I think originally he started out with like 12 or 13, and then they blossomed into 18 or 19. But his whole point was that we were spending too much time focusing on logical mathematical intelligence. We weren't doing right by our students, and we weren't recognizing their skill sets in a variety of domains. And I would say to you that having tremendous variety in skill sets, in the ways in which we think, is really critical for our future as a race, right? Having diverse thinkers, right, who come at problems with different perspectives and different tools and different skill sets. So anyway, he felt that this logical mathematical intelligence thing was too restrictive. Robert Ornstein, I love it. He came up with something he called the Western intelligence tradition, otherwise known as TWIT. And that pretty much tells you what he thought of the focus on logic and mathematical skills. Goldman felt like we weren't focusing on the right thing, and that emotional intelligence was hugely important in order to get us through our lives. Sternberg looked at problem-solving skills, he kind of went more into that realm of what we think about as executive function, the ability to execute plans and arrive at a goal or develop a product that had integrity to it, and to do that all efficiently. Here's Stanovich of reading fame, and Stanovich brought you the Matthew effects. He felt like most IQ tests didn't look at judgment and decision-making skills, kind of like align with Sternberger. And in general, and I'm sure you've come across this, intelligence tests have been accused of all kinds of sort of things that, in the wording here, I have unfairly stratifying test takers by race, gender, class, and culture, right? And we know, right, that once again, the stakes are really high, because when we measure, when we provide IQ scores for a different student, those are the scores through which, those are the windows through which educators look at their students. Question. Have you guys thought about whether you're lumpers or splitters? Don't want to go there yet, maybe in a little bit.
I'm gonna stand in the splitter camp. So
Yeah, well, I think, I'll fess up, and I'm going to tell you that I'm definitely a splitter for a couple of different reasons. One, in part, when we often generate that G, that representation of G, that full scale IQ, we lose all the good stuff. We lose all the strengths and weaknesses. We lose what makes that child like an individual, so I think that, and sometimes our kids are really complicated, and we really want to show their abilities. And that gets harder when we are reducing everything to like a full scale IQ. And a full scale IQ is kind of like an average, but not quite. I'm not going to go there, but think about what happens when we put things through an average machine. So anyway, there are a lot of concerns, and rightly so, about intelligence tests. So there's been a lot of work done to identify biases and concerns. Over the past several years, we have developed tests that delve more into brain science and are more, I'll say, educationally bent. And we have more options in terms of neuropsychological functioning, right? To kind of get in there and look at all those very specific abilities. So we use IQ tests today, right? That's the primary tool that we use to identify kids, right? With intellectual deficits, learning disabilities, and giftedness, full spectrum. We can use them to look at, I'm going to call it learning style, but I'm going to say that very carefully, so we use them to look at strengths and weaknesses and the different modes in which children can problem solve effectively. So, okay, I said to you that I talk a lot about the Wechsler intelligence scales, which is just one way of measuring intellectual functioning. If you go to team meetings, you might find that your evaluator is using the Woodcock-Johnson, another test that's really very commonly used. Sometimes evaluators are using something called the differential ability scales. There's the Stanford scales. There's all kinds of different tests. And yes, indeed, they're all based upon different views of what intelligence is and how it should be measured. So Wechsler is, I love it, is the author of several editions of tests. The Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, we're up to our 5th edition. The Adult Intelligence Scale, our 5th edition. We have the 4th edition for testing like really young kids. So there is a version of a Wechsler IQ test for just about everybody. He had his view of intelligence. Let's just take a look at that. The overall capacity of an individual to understand and cope with the world around him. And I think one of the reasons that I like the Wechsler test is that the things that we ask children to do are a little bit more complex and interesting. So we are actually asking children to solve problems, as opposed to asking them to perform a really, really narrow skill that tries to represent very, very specific functioning. So there's more of this looks at more of different types of problem solving abilities and looks at collections of skills, if you will, as opposed to measuring things in a really narrow sense, which is what the Woodcock-Johnson would do. So things that you need to know about IQ tests. They measure skills at any given point in time, right? So when we are measuring the skill of an 8-year-old, we are measuring their skill at that particular time in the context of their genetic makeup, in the context of the environment that they've experienced, in the context of the culture that they've experienced. IQ scores are fairly constant. So for the most part, the IQ scores that you're going to get in young children is going to be what you're going to see in middle school students and in adults. And I'm just going to qualify that a little bit and say that it's not unusual for the scores of really young children, like kids 4, 5, and 6, to come in a little bit high. And that's because we have to make do with a smaller sample of behavior, right? We can't test those kids for as long as we do like older students. Okay. So I told you that different IQ tests may very well yield different scores and sort of different profiles for the same student. And the fact is that there is the perspective of a given test, and then there's the perspective of the evaluator. And so evaluators always bring their own, I'll say, kind of personal view to the numbers that we are looking at. And sometimes it's really helpful to kind of say to your evaluator, so like, what is your view of intelligence? And when we look at these scores, what scores do you feel best represent this child's ability? So my last point here, I just wanted to remind you that, like, we talk about this being really the ultimate in high stakes testing. Like, I bring sort of a different meaning to it. So as I said, you know, when kids do nicely on an intelligence test and a measure of intellectual functioning, everyone is impressed and really pleased. When kids don't do so well, we develop certain prejudices about we may underestimate, right, their ability to perform in our classrooms. But we actually use, in some cases, IQ tests to measure the intellectual ability of adults who have been charged in capital punishment cases. And a few IQ points here and there can determine whether or not we would levy the death sentence on someone. The ultimate in high stakes testing. So other things you should know about IQ tests. Performance on IQ tests can be compromised in different ways, like the same way that performance on any kind of like achievement test, reading, writing, or math test. So kids who are anxious, kids who are tired, kids who are sick, right? Kids who struggle to pay attention and concentrate, kids who struggle with their, I'll say, executive function skills, kids who struggle with their language skills, who may understand things but have difficulty expressing it in a manner commensurate with their understanding, kids who don't like their evaluators. Evaluators work really hard. We try really hard to make sure that our students like us. And then, interestingly enough, the quality of the test materials themselves, right, can undermine a child's performance. And it turns out that when our test materials are kind of old and frayed, we get an old and frayed performance out of our student. So anyway, one of the responsibilities an evaluator has is to draw a conclusion about the validity of a child's performance. So in every report that an evaluator produces, there should be some line there that says, these scores that Sasha earned today are a valid representation of his or her cognitive functioning or academic skill. Okay, so a little bit more, and then we're going to dive into sort of the Wechsler scales. So the most popular view, and that kind of makes it sound like it's a like Time Magazine or Newsweek kind of thing, but the leading perspective, the leading view of what intelligence is right now is something called Cattell, Horn, Carroll, 3 researchers who came together and came up with a 3-tiered view of what intelligence is. And you can see G is at the top, right? So that overall view, that G as a singular entity, I kind of imagine it kind of like this point of light, you know, that then is divided into different domains. And the thing is about CHC theory, as we refer to it, and you know that assessment is the ability, is the field where we use all kinds of acronyms, is that we refer to these different domains. They're kind of like sub-intelligences. And you can see that here are my acronyms and here are my labels. So GF stands for fluid reasoning, GC comprehension knowledge. It takes a little bit of practice. It takes a little to get to be comfortable with them. But you can see that fluid reasoning, that's flexibility in thinking. Comprehension and knowledge would relate to vocabulary and world knowledge. Here we have short-term memory, visual processing. We're going to come back and go through some of these in a little bit. Auditory processing, how we handle information that we take in through our ears. We have a special domain for long-term storage and the ability to get to those things that we've known for a long time. GS, processing speed. So here's this idea that it's not just what you do, but it's your ability to do it efficiently, which is really important. In fact, CHC, the theory, devotes another whole domain to it, decision and reaction speed. And you can see here at the bottom that reading and writing made their way into the list as domains of intelligence, as well as quantitative knowledge, which would be mathematical functioning. Now, so these are all domains. And now think about each domain and how we could split it into different aspects of that particular area. So comprehension knowledge could consist of vocabulary. It could consist of a categorization skill, right? The ability to perceive how 2 things are like. What else could we find in there? Any kind of verbal reasoning ability. So comprehension and knowledge is the broader domain, but we can split it into finer abilities. The thing about the Woodcock-Johnson test was specifically designed to measure intellectual functioning a la CHC theory. So for that reason, many regard it to be the most current, the ultimate, right, in how it is that we measure intelligence. I find it a little less interesting because the domains are very narrow and the things that we ask children to do are very singular in their focus. And I want to say less interesting. And you could say to me, like, well, it's not about how you feel about, you know, like it's whether you're entertained or not, like, is it, Melissa? But I do think that we're really interested ultimately in problem solving skill as opposed to these really narrow domains. Does that make sense? A little bit. Once again, stop me. Questions? Thoughts?
So if I hear you correctly, the Wechsler takes into account
Yeah,
all of these very narrow aspects of the CHC and puts them in something that's,
it's a
I don't know, not easier to understand, but less complicated, not as complex.
so the Woodcock-Johnson is laid out just like this. So when you get a Woodcock-Johnson report, you're going to see each one of these domains and you're going to see what your student did. Wechsler's a little different. Wechsler doesn't quite include all of these. Wechsler has a different view of intelligence, right? So there are a lot of people out there who will do like a Wechsler intelligence scale and then supplement it so that they can get the full breadth of the different domains identified in CHC theory. And that starts to approach something that you may have heard of called a cross battery assessment, where evaluators really work hard to make sure that they are measuring skill in each one of those areas, right? Because remember, different theorists have different views of what intelligence is and what's important in intelligence. So they may very well group their domains differently, and they may opt to stress some domains over others.
Okay,
Melissa,
thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. Anybody else?
well, Melissa, is there ever a reason why you might give both? And
Oh, you could do
fullness?
that. I mean,
how would you, is there a way to easily look at the sort of the Gestalty part of the Wechsler one versus, and then be able to have the Woodcock-Johnson subtest sort of really support or maybe refute whatever?
yeah, and that happens all the time. So it's not unusual. So for example, in particular, if you hire like an outside evaluator for a second opinion, they may very well they're probably going to do a different measure of cognitive functioning, because these are not tests that we can repeat over short-term intervals. So people worry about there being a practice effect and oh my goodness, what happens if someone tests our kid in January and then we want to do the same test again in May or June. Like we try very hard not to do that, because some of these tests depend on something called novelty, and that we're looking at the ability to deal with things that you've never done before, novel processes. So what happens is if I do like a Wechsler and you do a Woodcock-Johnson, we may very well get different scores, and we may have to agree that those are all sort of different facets of the same child, certainly. And then we have to make a decision. We might have to, in the context of a learning disability evaluation, make a decision as to what scores, what domains best represent this child's ability. Because the Woodcock-Johnson G could be very, very different from the Wechsler intelligence scale, the full scale IQ. Got that? Okay, let me go on a little bit more, because there's okay. So why should you know about these? Like, how do they help us? The fact is that different abilities, right, different skills manifest themselves, support different kinds of academic activities. So for example, I'm just going to start here. When I see a child who has deficits in visual processing and fluid reasoning, which is the ability to reach into your cognitive toolbox and pull out the strategy that you need to do this thing you've never done before. Part of me is going, I really want to see this kid's math scores, because those skills are really important for math. When I see a kid who's struggling with G, C, which up here is called crystallized intelligence, the ability to acquire vocabulary, the ability to learn factual knowledge. Part of me is saying, gosh, I bet that's going to affect his reading comprehension. When I see deficits in processing speed, and I want you to see that, look at this, I talk about the speed thing as a component of intelligence. Processing speed manifests itself in reading skill, in writing skill, and in math skill. So that his ability to execute those underlying skills accurately and efficiently is really important for producing a product that has integrity. So when we look at strengths and weaknesses, in theory, what we are talking about at our team meetings is not just he's got this weakness. He's got a weakness in visual processing. It's understanding how that weakness undermines skill in math or skill in reading. Right? So different abilities support different abilities support skill in reading, writing, and math. And that when you see these scores over time, you get to see that there are patterns and that specific weaknesses often manifest themselves in specific academic challenges. So what's really nice is to look at a kid's profile as a whole and kind of go, yeah, and this makes sense. So this is just sort of a list. These are the skills that contribute to reading, the skills that contribute to writing, the skills that contribute to math. Let's look at the reading ones for just a second, since we're all really interested in reading. Crystallized intelligence is the ability to acquire vocabulary and factual information. Auditory processing, how it is we handle information that we take through our ears. Long-term retrieval, being able to hold on to that factual information for a long period of time, as well as short-term memory. Right? It's really hard to learn something if you can't kind of grab a hold onto it for a few seconds so that you can process it. Processing speed, the ability to execute processes with a reasonable degree of speed. Fluid intelligence, the ability to handle novelty, to pull out go into your toolbox and pull out the tool that you need at any given moment. And then visual processing, which we're going to talk about, the ability to perceive structure. And when you can perceive structure, that helps you organize your thoughts. And we're going to come back to that in a little bit. So when, for example, I see deficits in short-term memory, part of me is going, wow, that can affect reading, writing, math. And we're not even talking about language skills, right? Because it's really hard to process language if you can't like grab a hold of it so you can actually manipulate it. It kind of starts my brain going as to, I wonder how he's doing given this weakness. Questions, thoughts?
I don't have a question, but I do have a frustration. And it's so many psychologists when I'm at a team meeting
Okay.
don't know how to apply their understanding to reading and how it affects reading and explain it in a way that parents understand. And even more so, the thing that frustrates me the most, I go to lots and lots of districts doing professional development on reading evals, actually. And psychologists will stand up and know nothing about dyslexia and say, I am not I am not putting that on an IEP. I am not putting it in a report, and I don't believe all of this. I get that every single district I go to. And so we count on psychologists as being the ones who know the most. Like
Yes.
I've always thought when I was an educator, it's like, oh, they are the end all be all. They know everything. But so many psychologists don't have the knowledge about reading per se. They have the general psychological testing skills, but don't know how to apply it. And it frustrates, I don't know, it's just a frustration.
Well, I think it is kind of hard because, you know, we only know what we're trained to know. And many psychologists, the majority of them are not trained in reading, right? So
Right.
they may understand CHC theory, but they don't understand the underlying processes that are really important for reading, which kind of what makes me want to come back to this just for a second, because you might be thinking, okay, so where's phonological processing? So phonological processing would be under GA, would be under auditory processing, would be tucked in there. And RAN, I want to say it's probably under processing speed. It's probably tucked in there. Oh, let someone in here, hang on. Yeah. But yeah, I think, you know, and as you say, not only do we depend upon them to speak to reading, but we depend upon them to help us sift through all of this information on cognitive functioning. And there's a lot of, I'm going to use the word bias really carefully. There's biases in the instruments themselves, and there are biases on the part of the evaluator. Like, is your evaluator a lumper or a splitter? You know, and there are splitters and there's splitters. They're not all the same, too. All right, but we'll talk about that sort of a little bit more. Okay, so different weaknesses cause different problems. Okay, so this is the thing. We're in the field of education, so our definition of intelligence, what we think of as intelligence, is pretty much going to be the way we view it, dictated by what the law says about how we measure it. And I'm just going to pause here. We're going to unpack this just a little bit. So the idea is that I'm going to give you the pre-reading version, right? The idea is that we are supposed to select measures of intellectual function that show our child's ability and not their disability when we are doing a specific learning disability evaluation. Let me say that a little bit better. When we are testing for a learning disability, a lot of the times we're looking at a contrast between ability and how our kid is doing in reading, writing, and math. It's a contrast. So that ability is supposed to be, we're looking at our child's effective problem-solving skills and what they can do in all their glory, so that then we can look at the impact of the disability. So let's just look at this language just a minute. Tests are selected, administered so as to best to ensure that if a test is administered to a child with impaired sensory, manual, or speaking skills, the test results accurately reflect the child's aptitude or achievement levels or whatever other facts the test purports to measure, rather than reflecting the child's impaired sensual, manual, or speaking skills. There's like a lot of stuff in here, but let me give you an example. Let's say I have a child with a speech and language impairment, and I want to test that child's cognitive functioning because I want to measure of that child's ability, what we call intelligence. if I give them a test with a strong that requires a lot of speaking, what am I getting in the end? I'm getting a measure of what it is they can express as opposed to what it is they really know. Right? Because sometimes in kids, there's a big difference between what they understand and what they're actually able to express. This says, oh, I've got a kid with a speech and language impairment. I have to figure out how to measure his ability in a way that's not contaminated by his disability. Let me give you another example. So what if I have a child who's blind or severely visually impaired? I have to be really careful when I select my measure of intelligence, not to require him to do tasks that require visual processing, right? Because that would be ludicrous. We would no, this makes no sense, right? Because we would be measuring the impact of that child's visual impairment and not his real ability. Can you guys help me out? Because I'm looking at you and I'm just trying to figure out, can someone kind of put this into words for me a little bit? It helps me a lot. It's really good for you to do too.
I
I
think
think that, go ahead, Gwen.
And
yeah, and then feel free to fix it. So the way I understand it is you're trying to pick a test that is going to show the student's best abilities.
yes,
And so you want to make sure that when you're picking your measure, you're not going to pick a measure that is going to be highly dependent on their areas of greatest weakness. So if they have a speech and language issue, you wouldn't want to give them a test that required them to be extremely verbal and only get verbal responses. You'd want to make sure there were examples where they could show what they know through manipulations or writing.
perfect, beautiful. Okay, so this is a big deal when we're trying to measure ability in the context of a learning disability evaluation, because the law kind of says we need to focus on that ability so that we then can contrast it to what is happening in reading, writing, math. Okay, but I'm going to move us up. So measuring intelligence, I'm going to say, is a little bit more complicated. And we have something called the Matthew effects, and everyone's heard about the Matthew effects, and we know that it has something to do with vocabulary not developing. So over time, let's say I measure a child's IQ when they're 6, and I measure it again when they're 9 or 10, and then I measure it again when they're 13. And if this child is not a reader, if they can't access information in print, we oftentimes see this lackluster performance on verbal tasks when they hit middle school and high school. And I'm using that word lackluster, but we may well see slight drops in their scores over time, because typical intellectual development, the development of verbal skills anyway, presumes that we have access to content through our ears and that we have access to content in print, because the two are very different. And I always it always makes me smile when I think about the fact that if we were to actually look at the quality of language that we use around the dinner table, we would find that language would come in at a 2nd and 3rd grade level, even in very well-educated homes. Because we don't use the same kind of vocabulary when we're chit-chatting as the vocabulary encounter when we read, and that permits us to explore things in much greater depth. Okay. So lack of reading experience is harmful to your intellectual health And over time, our students are essentially language deprived, and they don't develop their verbal thinking skills in the way that we would hope. So we would see those the vocabulary might not develop. Similarities measures categorization skill and the ability to perceive how two things are alike. Information is a test. These are all Wechsler scale tests, but information lets us look at the ability to remember factual information related to history or the science or general knowledge. And comprehension is the ability to answer why questions, but these are all tasks that presume verbal thinking skills. And you can't develop your verbal thinking skills in the way that you should if you are not reading. So, and this is kind of brings me to an interesting point. And you guys know, so when we get older students who haven't been reading, we know we can teach them to decode. Like, right? If we do it, they will learn it. What we're not so great at, and what nobody's ever been able to explain to me to my satisfaction, is how we make up for those years of lost reading experience. Decoding is really easy to teach in comparison to getting all that vocabulary into students, into those verbal reasoning skills, categorization skills, all that factual information, and the ability to deal with the whys and wherefores of society. Does that make sense? Like, we can teach decoding, but how do we make up for this lost reading experience? And I think that it's something that we need to have more of a conversation about, because it's hard to make up for that lost time. I'm going to leave that right there, and I'm going to move us on, because I want to be sure I want to come back to the Matthew effects, but I want to get through a little bit more. So the Wechsler intelligence scale, as I told you, I like it because it looks more at what they call problem solving skill. It will give us a full scale IQ if we want it, which is that G, that singular point of light or intelligence. And it looks at skill in 5 main domains. Looks at verbal thinking skills, visual spatial skills, fluid reasoning, which is about novelty, working memory and processing speed. Verbal comprehension is all about words. Words are we need a lot of words in order to think good thoughts. It's really hard to think good thoughts without having words. Now, I just kind of betrayed to you like what I think verbal intelligence plays a really important role in intellectual functioning, but other folks might disagree with me. It looks at similarities, which is how facts, things, and concepts are alike. And we know, because we work in the field of reading, that breadth and depth of word knowledge is just really, really important. It also looks at visual spatial skills. And it was like, before I got into this field, I used to think about visual spatial skills in terms of like architecture, right? Building buildings and that kind of thing. How, like in doing puzzles, how shapes fit together in space. And what it took me longer to understand is that this idea of structure and how things fit together, it's not just about puzzle pieces or the pieces of a building. It's about how facts and concepts fit together too. And what you will see is that kids who struggle with visual spatial reasoning, their thoughts are often disjointed, they're disorganized, and these are the kids that have trouble generating a gestalt. They can't pull all those isolated facts and fit them together to generate a main idea. So visual spatial thinking is really important. I think in terms of like, it always makes me think of like a paragraph, writing a paragraph. So a well-written paragraph, right, has that your introductory sentence, your topic sentence, that's like your gestalt, your supporting details, and they all have to fit together like logically and sequentially, right? So the structure of a paragraph is very much like the structure of a building, where we have foundation pieces that have to come together and then we put a roof over it. Intellectually, it's the same skill. It's also really important for math. And here you can see I put my numbers over here. We define number values by virtue of their relative position in space. So 23 is different from a 32, is different from a 2 over 3, is different from a 2.3, a 3.2, or a 3 to the second power. And I have changed the value of my numbers all by changing their relative position. So it is spatial thinking that's really important for number values and for place value, right? Think about place value and how challenging that is if you don't get how pieces fit together in space. Do I have your attention? Isn't that really cool? I think it's fascinating. Okay. Fluid reasoning about novelty, flexible thinking, the ability to reach into your cognitive toolbox and pull out whatever strategy you need at the time. It's about pattern recognition. There's a lot of people who feel if they could only measure one thing in the field of intelligence, that this is what they would measure. And there are actually some IQ tests out there that are totally based upon matrix reasoning and pattern recognition. I don't know if I have a sample here. I don't have a sample here. But it's all about perceiving a pattern and figuring out what's essential, what's not essential, and what comes next. Feel free to stop me. So Wechsler scales, most models of intelligence have a place for working memory. I think about working memory as cognitive workspace, where we take in, like it's like a platter. We take in new information, we put it on our platter, we mold it, we manipulate it with the things that we already know, so that then we can store it for permanent access. We tend to measure memory by seeing how much stuff how much content we can stuff into kids' heads. We ask them to repeat numbers. How many numbers can you repeat forward? That's like telephone memory. That's what you do when someone gives you a phone number. Numbers in reverse and in sequence. Now we're taking those numbers and we're manipulating them. We're moving them around a little bit. That manipulation part is huge in terms of just about everything that we do. We can also measure it pictorially. And we, on the Wechsler scales, ask kids to identify. We show them pictures and then we ask them to identify the pictures that we showed them in sequence. So working memory, is also, I'm just going to use another word for, considered to be a domain of executive function. So executive function is not separate from this whole thing that we are doing with cognition. In fact, working memory is a huge, huge part of this thing that we call EF. Questions? I'm kind of covering a lot because I want to be sure that in a little time, but I want to be sure I bring us back to the Matthew effects. We're okay? Okay. And then we have this thing called processing speed. So this is sort of an example, a made-up example of one way in which processing speed is measured on a WISC, and we give kids a numeric symbol code, and then we give them like the numbers, and then while we time them, they have to put in the matching symbols. So the idea is that faster is better, because if you have a faster processing speed, I think about it like the processing speed on a computer, like faster is better. Then in theory, you could do things more easily. You might also be able to consider more options as you arrive at your final product. it's really important. We see that kids who struggle with processing speed may struggle with written expression because it's really hard for them to get that language in the brain down their arms and out their fingers and on the paper. And notice that this is done with pencil in hand. So if that process of writing is laborious for you, it's going to be really hard for you to write with a flow and get your thoughts on paper. It sort of mirrors what we know about like reading fluency, right? We know that if reading is really labored, then it's hard for kids to focus on the content. And the same thing happens with written expression, and the same thing will happen with math. So if you are struggling with your basic math facts, it's going to be hard for you to do long division. So I'm just going to go back here just for a second. So here's my model. You can see that the Wechsler cognitive domains include these 5 areas: verbal thinking, visual spatial, fluid reasoning, all about flexibility and pattern recognition. And here's both working memory and processing speed. Sometimes that full-scale IQ is a good representation of a child's overall ability. And that kind of presumes that these 5 domains are coming in more or less the same. Not exactly the same. Everyone's going to have some variation. But sometimes the full-scale IQ is not a good representation. If, for example, verbal thinking skills, visual spatial skills, and fluid reasoning are really strong, but working memory and processing speed are really weak. All right, so this is a kid who kind of knows a lot, but has a poor memory and is really slow to boot. And if you have a poor memory and you're really slow to boot, the two just kind of like aggravate each other, make it really hard to do anything easily, efficiently, and accurately. In that particular case, then we can break that full scale IQ apart and we can do something called a general ability index and look at that as a measure of ability. So we have different ways of teasing apart these scores. That is, those of us who are splitters, right? To try to separate out what's ability versus what's the disability. Questions on that? I'm taking you through kind of like a whole lot of stuff today. Okay.
I don't know if this is the time to ask this question, but I've been having conversations with people about reading screening and like 4-year-old to first grade kind of screening.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that in that particular case, you're just looking for the kids who have deficits so that you can teach to fill those gaps in so they can progress. Whereas this intelligence testing is just specifically more for identifying special education needs, not just a general kindergartner who's struggling with, hearing the sounds and words or something like that.
So a screening test, you're right, is really designed to look at kids who are at high risk for reading failure so that we can get right in there and respond. And they're supposed to be supposed to be really carefully designed, and they'll have sort of like a threshold. And if we come in below that threshold, well, then we're at risk. And if we achieve that threshold, we're probably okay. So they should be able to show us a lot of research about the statistics of it all and how many kids they identify correctly versus the number, like, do they over-identify kids? Do they under-identify kids? I mean, the idea is to it's that Goldilocks rule to come in like just at that kind of right level so that we can pull out the kids we think are at risk and respond to them immediately. And at this particular point, we're not really asking the question, is this a specific learning disability? We're only asking the question is, are we at risk?
Yeah, right. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. So I thought it might be helpful if I kind of pulled out like a few questions you could think about asking evaluators, so like, why are we using this test? Like, what is your view of intelligence? How will this test help us understand this kid better? I think that's a really important thing. And like, do we need to supplement this test with other measures in order to get a more comprehensive picture? Like, is what you're doing giving us a comprehensive view of this child? So, I'm going to say in the olden days, but I've been doing this for a while, but I would go to tea meetings and they would have done a cognitive test, something like a Wechsler, and they would do a reading test and they would say there was no disability because there was no deficit or weakness. And what was the problem? Like, it's like, well, if we don't actually go there and look, then we're not going to see a weakness. But they didn't understand that their own testing wasn't complete and wasn't giving us a full view. In particular, wasn't giving us a view of those underlying processes that are so important for reading. So, is it possible the student's disability will compromise his or her ability to express what she knows on this test? A kid with a speech and expressive language deficit might have a significant challenge communicating to us what they really know, right? So their expressive language won't be commensurate with their understanding. And then, of course, there's a whole thing in this field about, is this test appropriate for children with different cultural backgrounds or kids who are learning English as a second language? So can you imagine administering a test with a large verbal component to a child who is just learning English? What are we going to get? We're not going to get a measure of their ability. We're just going to get a measure of what their current skill with expressive language is. So after an evaluation, are these scores a valid measure of this child's ability? Should be in every report. What does this test tell us about our kid's profile as a learner? And how do these strengths and our weaknesses play a role in learning to read, write, and do math? Let's better understand those strengths. Let's better understand the weaknesses and how they manifest themselves in our kids' ability to function in the classroom and learn. Is this evaluation commensurate with past evaluations of cognitive functioning? And do we need to do any follow-up testing? But once again, I'll come back to this idea that there are lumpers and splitters out there, and that just think about it for a second. So let's say I'm a lumper and I believe that that one value of G is an appropriate measure of my child's functioning. A splitter might say, no, that's not appropriate because my kid is really good in terms of verbal and visual spatial thinking and has weaknesses in other areas. And that when I smush them all together and kind of sort of get that average, I'm now getting an underestimate. Does that make sense to everybody? Did I say that clearly enough? Okay. Okay. All right. I'm gonna move us ahead to Matthew effects, and if we have time, we'll come back to that. But I think that this is really, really important. So we know we have this understanding of the failure to read, of kids who are in reading failure, not developing their verbal thinking skills. But as I said, it's kind of the effect of that is actually much larger. And I don't think we really get it and that we really think about this in our students who are delayed in their reading skills. So I'm going to ask that question sort of at the beginning. And when our kids are delayed in their reading skills and we haven't taught them how to decode, and they are now like in middle school or entering high school, how is it that we make up for those years of lost reading experience? Because that reading experience is really key to the development of your verbal thinking skills, which the ability to think with words, the ability to think with language is extremely important in the society, given that literacy is a prerequisite, right, for pursuing post-secondary training. It's a prerequisite for going to college. It's a prerequisite for being employed in an interesting field and then having access to medical care and also being able to own your own home. Like there's just a long trail of things. So Jean Chall, who's like, it's funny, we don't talk a whole lot about Jean Chall. Jean Chall came out in the 70s and early 80s with something called the stages of language and reading development. She helped us understand sort of the sequential nature of the acquisition of reading skills. Now we're more like simultaneous because now we look at the reading rote, but she kind of preceded that. And actually it was like studying Jean Chall that first sort of clued me into how kids learn how to read. So she had a lot to say about the development of reading skill being important for individual development and for the development of our society. But let's talk about Matthew effects. Gospel according to Matthew. Okay, so here it is. For to everyone who has will more be given, and he will have abundance, but from him who has not, even what he has will be taken away. Okay, so this is the idea that kids who excel at decoding, kids who start off really strong, are going to engage in a lot of reading. They're going to get a lot of practice. They're going to solidify their decoding skills, and they're going to have really good access to content. Kids who struggle with reading, decoding, all the way back in kindergarten and first grade, are understandably not going to be enthusiastic readers. They are not going to be able to engage in reading. They're not going to develop their vocabularies, and then a whole slew of things starts to happen to them. So the challenge with reading failure goes back to like kindergarten and first grade. And I have to tell you, I had two sons. I have one who was reading extraordinarily well when he was like in kindergarten, and my other son turned out to be I call him a whopping dyslexic. He was dyslexic and dysgraphic, and he struggled in kindergarten. He struggled in first grade, and here I was, someone just sort of starting out in the field, and people would say to me, well, make sure your kid reads. You need to make sure that he's reading. And it was like, there was nothing that I could do on the face of the earth to convince this kid like that he needed to spend more time reading. Couldn't make it happen because he just didn't have the skill set. So anyway, the challenges develop in kindergarten and first grade. Written language offers us opportunities that we don't get when we're chit-chatting with friends. And I just kind of wanted to go through them. So language in print, yes, it helps us develop our vocabularies. It helps us not only develop our vocabularies, but it helps us develop our sense of syntax and how it is we express ourselves at the sentence level. So how words are chunked into phrases and clauses, and in the different kinds of ways that we can structure our sentences. And I have decided that we do not teach like educators about sentence structure in the way that we should, because it's not just about like grammar. Like it got bad press many, many years ago. Syntax was about grammar. The thinking was we couldn't teach kids grammar, or we weren't very good at it, so we kind of abandoned the whole thing. And it is this understanding at the sentence level that helps us express facts. It helps us with compound sentences And complex sentences take two facts or concepts and relate them to each other. So it is our skill with syntax that helps us, that's the building blocks for good thinking skills and permits us then to move on to paragraphs. So through reading, you get to encounter a lot of different kinds of sentences and the way that people express themselves, and you actually develop your sort of awareness of how it is people express themselves and what it all means. There are some that say that being required to read actually stimulates your short-term memory, your verbal short-term memory, and that if you are required to read, if you read a lot and that you encounter a lot of content, that all of that content is going to come in through your short-term memory and into that working memory platter and essentially exercise your short-term memory and your working memory platter. So that the thinking is kids who are working with a lot of content will develop, if you will, the memory skills to be able to handle it all. We know that we talk about vocabulary. Here's my thing on background knowledge. We learn about the world. We know, like, anyone who's trained in reading is trained in reading comprehension and the importance of background knowledge. Metalinguistic awareness, not just your awareness of content, but how it is expressed. The questions of language style or language perspective. And I think that one of the things that we are experiencing today is that we have created a generation of individuals who are not particularly good readers and don't have that capacity, first of all, to access content, right? Because we know that like a third of the population out there are not strong decoders, but also the ability to evaluate that content and think about it critically and think about the perspective of the author and evaluate the source and be able to distinguish truth from falsehoods and nonsense. Right? So these evaluative skills are just come from reading over the years. And then finally, I have phonemic awareness, and you know that we have research that says that as kids become more proficient at decoding, like Linnea Airy kind of says that proficiency, that recognition of sound symbol correspondence helps kids to better perceive sound patterns in words. So I'm just going to stop for a second because first of all, Matthew effects are plural. They're not singular. So it's not just about vocabulary and background knowledge. It's about all of that cognitive verbal, that cognitive skill that we bring to being able to think things through and think about things deeply and draw good conclusions. So I just said a whole lot. Thoughts?
I'm thinking about this quote from your book. It's on page 169 and makes me think about how the vocabulary piece and the language they're interactive, so that they're feeding each other. That it says, according to Metzala's lexical restructuring model,
Yes.
Increases in vocabulary are accompanied by a restructuring in the way that words are stored. So that as children acquire more words, they develop a need to store words with greater precision.
Yeah.
So the vocabulary feeds your need, or it feeds the brain restructuring, and then you learn how to read, and then you learn more vocabulary, and it kind of goes back and forth. And just thinking about I teach multilingual learners, and thinking about how, you know, that really early vocabulary development is so important.
Well, that too. So, and now you're kind of, what you're doing is really cool because it's like now we're looking at this across the lifespan. So with our really young kids, and we know that deficits in those language milestones speak to a child's risk status So when kids don't achieve their verbal milestones on schedule, they are at higher risk for challenges with reading. And we can actually go back to vocabulary, like in kids who are 2 and 3-year-olds. And yes, so this whole idea of restructuring is that if you don't have a lot of words in your heads, you don't need a very detailed filing cabinet to put those words in. You just don't. But the more words you get with like similar sound patterns and so forth, you have to move from storing words as a whole syllable to storing them phoneme by phoneme. And the only way we get there is by stuffing kids' heads filled with words so that they have to adjust their internal filing cabinet and store words phoneme by phoneme. And if we store words phoneme by phoneme, we then at some point can go, oh my goodness, words have sounds and I know they're there, right? So does that make sense? So it's a very, very cool thing. So kids who have delays in their language development are not only at risk for processing the language of the text that they read, they are also at risk for developing their phonemic awareness and their decoding skills. It's a double whammy. And then if we don't teach those kids to read, they won't develop their verbal thinking skills in a way that we would hope and expect, because they're not getting access to language both through their ears and in print. So we need both for healthy cognitive development. Thoughts on that? How are we doing?
It makes me really think about the role of read alouds and rich language conversations as kids are learning to read, so that they're building all of that language, at least until they have the capacity to take it off the page.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, the fact is that we have the simple view, which says we really need to develop skills in both domains, right? We need to develop those decoding skills and we need to develop those language skills, because it's those verbal thinking abilities ultimately enhanced by spatial thinking skills, enhanced by fluid reasoning, enhanced by working memory and processing speed, that give us the intellectual power to think things through and think about them deeply. And I'm just going to bring you back. I'm going to say it one more time. If you look at the statistics of how we're doing in terms of the number of proficient readers, we only have 1/3 of our population, right, that are proficient readers. So 2/3 of our population have not been able to get to all this good stuff. And that's a societal issue. Any more thoughts?
I'm also wondering about the role of audiobooks, or I have 2 students in mind. One who's the daughter of a teacher who's severely dyslexic, and she's now a college student, but when she was not able, she was listening to Harry Potter and that very high level thinker.
Yeah.
And she was able to compensate that way. But I'm also thinking of a 2nd grade student that I have now who he's learning how to read, but at the same, he's just like an autodidact on YouTube. And so he'll come and ask me about the human digestive system and sphincter muscles, things that he has heard.
Yeah.
Can we leverage, how can we leverage that? Or I had a student several years ago who he loved the Animal Channel, Animal Planet. And so it was definitely very piecemeal, but how can we leverage that kind of knowledge that they get orally into reading?
Well, I think that this audio, like while we're teaching kids to decode, we have to give them audiobooks. So during that silent reading period in the classroom, when some kids are opening their books, the kids who can't decode should be plugging themselves in and putting their earbuds in, right? And using that time to listen to high quality language, you know. So it's got to be written language is just so different from the chit chat that we do. It has a more sophisticated vocabulary. The syntax is more varied and more sophisticated. The content, right, is just is developed in a way that we don't experience when we are just talking. So I do think like audiobooks are huge in terms of helping kids to develop their thinking skills while we turn them into decoders. So anyway, well, it's just about 5:30. Let's see what else. Here we go. So kids who do poorly at the start are going to struggle with their phonemic awareness. Classroom materials are too challenging, motivation is reduced, and reading becomes something that's tolerated at best and to be avoided at worst. So anyway, I think that's it for today. I know Sandy, you and I are gonna chat for a little bit, I think. Okay, and we are meeting again in all this other stuff. So when are we meeting? On the 19th? His birthday. And I'll find something in the decoding, comprehension, or informal inventory chapters. And you are welcome to come up with questions if there's anything that you would like in particular to talk about. And I'm just going to let you know that I am starting a case study series in April where we're going to take a profile and we're going to go through child's profile, beginning with teacher comments, progress monitoring scores. We're going to move into achievement testing, and then we're going to look at language testing and then supplement it with the cognitive testing to see what this all does for us in terms of understanding this child. So, and that's it. So I'm going to stop recording now.